How? The 12 steps allowed my sceptical self to recover. Chapter 1. The allergy and obsession problem. I want to understand alcoholism. I want to recover from it. I'm writing this book mainly for myself, as through writing I allow my thoughts to slow down enough and my research to sink in a little. I intend to document what I find and summarize it in a way that makes most sense to me, making leaps and connections between things irrespective of the effect that others may have made them. To me, the very process of making these connections is part of my healing. After some exploration, I chose Alcoholics Anonymous as my guide. AA was founded in 1935 by Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith, who 4 years later wrote the book that remains the foundation of the program, Alcoholics Anonymous, and known simply as the Big Book. The Big Book starts by laying a medical foundation. The chapter, The Doctor's Opinion, is at the very beginning to aid in reaching the awareness, acknowledgement, and acceptance of being an alcoholic, as this is what the program itself is based upon. This chapter was written by Dr. William Duncan Silkworth, a physician at Towns Hospital in New York City, which specialized in treating alcoholics and drug addicts. Bill Wilson was his patient, and it was Dr. Silkworth who gave Bill the crucial insight that alcoholism is not a moral failing but a medical condition, an allergy of the body combined with an obsession of the mind. Although not disputing the veracity of the source and the truth of this statement, the two keywords here eluded me: allergy and obsession. Was it because both terms were dated in the 1930s and their semantic meaning reflected the current medical science knowledge of the times? Do I therefore risk to misunderstand them, as to my modern layman's eyes, the semantic clinical meaning associated with both terms could be vastly different to that of those times? I was approaching the Big Book in good faith, so I simply trusted that the answer to both questions was yes. But I'm a doubting Tom, if you will, and in addition to that, I really thought I needed to understand the doctor's opinion truly, not just place blind faith on it. Otherwise, with the passing of time, I could eventually stumble through the full program, as the foundation wouldn't have been solid. My research therefore focused initially on allergy of the body and obsession of the mind, the allergy of the body. Just understanding the concept of allergy of the body took me forever. It seems like they were really referring to alcoholism as to a physical disease, but throughout my life, I always heard about alcoholism as a lack of willpower, a pit only disgraceful people fall into, people with not enough education or social support. And then I heard things such as, after the loss of his wife, he became a drunk, etc. Nothing physical about that, so how come I was to have an actual, real disease? In other words, do I now have to start believing that this is not my fault? Do I have to overcome the deeply ingrained preconceived idea, common to society and to myself, and that every alcoholic is at fault? The reason why I found so difficult to admit I was an alcoholic lies exactly in the word admit. I am admitting being something negative. For example, I admit being a thief. I admit being a liar, a murderer, and so on. But I say or I state that I have green eyes, or I say that I like to read. I don't have to admit that I have green eyes or that I like to read. Along the same lines, one doesn't admit to have cancer, another often fatal disease. One says they have cancer. Nobody diagnosed with cancer feels compelled to understand exactly the biochemistry and medicine that causes cancer in the first place in order to admit that they have it. Because they don't have to admit that they have it. There's nothing to admit for them. They simply have it. Society and themselves do not have the preconceived idea that having cancer is their fault, so they simply say or state that they have cancer. But for me, yes, this was caused by me. I was at fault. It is my fault I became an alcoholic. It is my fault I cannot get out of it. It is my fault I'm relapsing into it. So if the idea here is to convince myself that I'm not at fault, making it a matter of faith, a matter of believing what others are saying does nothing to convince me. I want to arrive to see exactly why they say that it's not my fault. I want to understand it because I want to feel that I can state that I'm an alcoholic. I don't want to have to admit it. Let's start with the real situation. My experience, and that of all the other alcoholics I have been meeting in AA, is that we face these two specific problems regarding drink. 1. Once we start drinking, there's no telling where we end up. Although we all know we increasingly end up in blackouts or, generally speaking, in trouble, while others around us can have a couple of drinks resting, assured that neither will happen to them. 2. Even if we resolve not to drink, and even if we are sober for a certain amount of time, we inevitably end up drinking even if we did not mean to. Let's see if this allergy concept explains some or all of it. In 1939, the term allergy in medical usage was much broader and looser than it is today. Today, when we hear allergy, we think of a histamine response, immunoglobulin E antibodies, and anaphylaxis. So we think of a very specific immunological mechanism, but Dr. Silkworth wasn't using it in that sense. He was using it to describe an abnormal physical reaction to a substance that other people can tolerate normally. In his day, that was within the accepted range of what allergy could mean in medical parlance, an idiosyncratic bodily response. Dr. Silkworth and the founding members of AA were describing something closer to what today's gold standard in addiction medicine calls impaired control over use. Dr. Silkworth's allergy concept maps remarkably well onto modern scientific and clinical research on addiction and alcoholism. He didn't have the biochemistry to prove it in the late 1930s. His clinical observation was essentially correct. Something happens in the alcoholic's body that doesn't happen in the body of the normal drinker, and it triggers behaviors that willpower alone cannot overcome. The ASAM framework, the ASAM Principles of Addiction Medicine, published in 1994 and in its current 7th edition of 2023, contributed to by over 350 experts, describes this in terms of physical, neurobiological changes to pathways and areas of the brain, neuroadaptations in the stress and reward systems that firmly ground alcoholism in the physical world. Same phenomenon, modern vocabulary. So then, what is the modern vocabulary I can use in my head to sort of translate allergy in words that I can understand? Well, it seems that there is no single word today that really maps well to what allergy was termed back then and what Silkworth was intending when using it with reference to alcohol abuse. However, there are a few real alternatives possible. A pathological, abnormal, metabolic response. A substance-induced neurobiological dysregulation, quoted from ASAM. I believe I could safely say today, therefore, that what Silkworth called an allergy is an abnormal metabolic response, a fundamentally different way the alcoholic's body processes alcohol, producing a physical craving and behaviors that the normal drinker does not experience. According to ASAM, the physical craving and the behavior of an alcoholic is scientifically shown to be rooted in clearly identified physical, pathological, and chronic processes. So when I picked up ASAM, I couldn't stop reading. The meanders of our brain. We get here into what's currently known of neuroscience, which is far more advanced than what Dr. Silkworth knew, but not as exact yet as maths. Neuroimaging studies show the prefrontal cortex lighting up consistently during tasks involving decision-making, impulse control, and weighing consequences. The fact that also patients with damaged prefrontal cortex cannot carry out those tasks would seem to confirm that this is the function of that region in the brain. The prefrontal cortex is therefore the brain's executive decision-making center. It does several things simultaneously. It evaluates consequences, it inhibits impulses, it weighs short-term reward against long-term cost, and it makes the final call on behavior. It's the part of the brain that says, "I have had enough," or "this isn't a good idea," or "I'll regret this tomorrow." What makes the prefrontal cortex appearing to behave so abnormally towards alcohol and not towards other things? Why do I not have an apples and oranges addiction? On the surface, it would seem like it's all down to a malfunction, temporary at first, then chronic, of the prefrontal cortex when alcohol is involved. It's a malfunction caused by alcohol and specific to alcohol, whether that is present or absent. I am imagining the prefrontal cortex like this big executive, in this big executive decision-making center. Any executive makes decisions based on information received by their senior staff. Like most CEOs in the business world, the executive hasn't a clue if the information they receive is biased, too much or too little, or even true at all, despite the executive's ability to evaluate information, to downplay impulsive directors, to weigh profits versus costs, immediate rewards versus long-term consequences. If they are fed wonky data, they have no choice but to arrive at the wrong decisions without knowing they were wrong and without having had a real choice. So on the surface, the CEO is still making a wrong decision, true, but is performing his job perfectly. The wrong decisions are his executive team's fault. Tell that to Wall Street. Clearly, here the CEO is the prefrontal cortex and their senior staff, each culpable of feeding wonky information, are the reward system, the stress system, the HPA system, the neuroregulatory system, compounded by a deputy CEO, who is the default mode network, the DMN, that further confuses these already wonky data. Each single one of these systems is affected by alcohol, gets changed by it, eventually gets damaged by it, and for the most part cannot recover from it to its previous homeostasis, its normal, balanced baseline, even after prolonged periods of abstinence. Therefore, the malfunction is not in the prefrontal cortex itself, but in the systems that feed it. When we hear that in addiction, the prefrontal cortex exhibits a loss of control, the statement is misleading. Its decisions to pick up drink after drink or to pick up a drink after a long period of abstinence are not a loss of control. They are the prefrontal cortex functioning exactly as designed, but on the wrong information. This is great. Now we are hearing that the whole thing has as physical a cause as any other illness. If we were talking about a broken arm, I'd love to see the X-rays. In this case, I began to read ASAM as if it were a Bible, and I'm going to summarize it, picking the relevant parts. While ASAM remains the source of truth, this is my structure and understanding of what they say. A word of warning, there are a lot of unavoidable medical terms, and you need to concentrate a little at times in order to follow our complicated meanders within the brain, but I promise you it will be worth it. It is also quite a long section, but you'll be amazed at what you find out. As I'm writing after having completed that part of my research, I can happily spoil the finale and tell you that you will also, like me, come to truly understand that they were right. That alcoholism can be at least described as a physical disease. As we're now going through each of the senior staff members at the executive table, we'll start with the deputy CEO, the default mode network, or DMN, as it really helps understand the inevitability of the mislabeled malfunction of the prefrontal cortex and why, when I start, I cannot stop. The DMN is a set of interconnected brain regions that is most active when a person is focused on internal mental states and reflects the enhanced awareness of the desire for the drug. In scientific medical terms, this awareness is physical because it is interoceptive, whereby interoception they label the brain's ability to sense, interpret, and integrate signals from within the body. When it malfunctions, the default mode network intensifies the interoceptive awareness of the desire and craving, adding its own pressure to the prefrontal cortex on top of the abnormal signals already coming from the other systems. Therefore, ASAM emphasizes that craving is not purely cognitive. It is a physiological state felt in the body, which is why patients often describe it as something they feel rather than merely think. Let's now get to the reward system. In a normal brain, the reward circuitry responds to natural pleasures like food, social connection, achievement. The response to normal life stimuli is a generation of dopamine that is sufficient for the functioning of the brain and the survival of the species. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a messenger between neurons that signals reward and motivation. When something feels good or important, dopamine tells the brain, remember this, do it again. It's the brain's way of reinforcing survival useful behaviors. When they talk about the reward circuitry, they intend the whole journey of chemical signals carried by dopamine from the regions of origin in which dopamine is generated, and which are the ventral tegmental area, VTA, and the substantia nigra, and the region of destination, the nucleus accumbens, where the dopamine gets released to, and in which the brain processes and makes decisions for something it interprets as important for survival. This is why the nucleus accumbens on its own is often referred to as the reward system or the pleasure center. When the brain receives normal life stimuli, a taste, smell, a situation, a feeling, a memory, it processes them and then sends down to the VTA a measured amount of processing results, which the VTA releases as a measured amount of chemistry signals, producing the required measured amount of dopamine to carry them. Dopamine travels along the axon, a fiber, and crosses the synapse, the gap between the axon and the dopamine receptors of the nucleus accumbens. The dopamine receptors, primarily two types called D1 and D2, are proteins embedded in the cell membrane, therefore the surface of the postsynaptic neurons of the nucleus accumbens. They are both shaped to receive a dopamine molecule the way a lock receives a key. When dopamine binds to the receptor, the receiving neuron fires a signal internally that the brain interprets as reward. After the dopamine binds successfully, it does not need to remain in the synapse, the gap between the axon and the nucleus accumbens. Therefore, it is cleared by either being reabsorbed by the originating sending neuron in the VTA through dopamine transporters or broken down by enzymes. This facilitates the D1 and D2 receptors, which are designed to operate upon impulse and not continuously. Clearing the synapses ensures that the receptors are properly deactivated before the next impulse. This means that at this point the system resets and is ready for the next stimulus. At this point we understand how the reward system works under normal conditions. So what happens under alcohol intake? When the brain receives stimuli provoked by alcohol intake or other extraneous substance, it floods the VTA with many more processing results when comparing it with other normal life pleasurable activity, taking a walk, hugging someone. Therefore, we hear that alcohol is hijacking this system. Indeed, the nucleus accumbens receptors D1 and D2 on the postsynaptic neurons need to defend themselves from being overstimulated during alcohol intake, which is a natural, physical, defensive response at the cellular level. They respond by reducing the number of available receptors and also by reducing the sensitivity of those remaining. From a cellular and chemical perspective, this is what happens in this defense mechanism. First of all, we have what is labeled a receptor internalization, where the neuron physically pulls receptors off its own surface, drawing them back inside the cell membrane. They're not destroyed immediately. They're stored internally and under normal pulse conditions, and we know that internalized receptors get eventually recycled back to the surface. But in the meantime, they are no longer available to receive dopamine, which means fewer locks on the surface, so fewer keys can engage. This effectively limits the amount of dopamine that binds to those D1 and D2 neurons. Secondly, we have what they term a reduced receptor sensitivity, where the receptors that remain on the surface undergo a chemical change, typically a phosphorylation, which is the addition of a phosphate group to the receptor protein. This alters the receptor's shape slightly, so that even when the dopamine binds to them, the internal signal it generates is weaker. The lock still accepts the key, but the mechanism it triggers inside is somewhat damaged. This defense mechanism is what ASAM calls the downward regulation of the reward system caused by alcohol intake. While these changes that occur when drinking heavily, once or twice, are quite temporary. If the heavy drinking sessions continue, the person develops a tolerance, what we drinkers admiringly call holding the drink very well. What tolerance actually means is that due to this natural defense mechanism, the same given amount of alcohol intake generates a smaller amount of reward signals than the person remembers from the first couple of times, because less dopamine is permitted to bind to the receptors. The instinctual behavior of the drinker is therefore to increase the alcohol intake compared to the previous couple of times, with the objective to feel the same pleasure equals rewards as before. When we drink more, we are unknowingly trying to overcome the nucleus accumbens defenses. By the instinctual behavior, what we obviously mean is the decision taken by the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex has received a signal from the reward system that there is not enough dopamine. However, the data it receives is wrong because incomplete. The reward system does not also inform it that the reason why there is not enough dopamine is that it had put its own defense mechanism in place. So the reward system is both automatically smart to survive and quite stupid in evaluating which message to provide. On top of this wrong information, the DMN intervenes and amplifies the message, making it a very compelling argument. The CEO puts in place the instinctual behavior based on the wrong information. It becomes a biological, natural vicious circle. Drinking more produces more dopamine, which over time obliges the nucleus accumbens to defend itself even more, further reducing the number of receptors available and further desensitizing the remaining ones to dopamine. So consequently, the person's behavior, enacting decisions taken by their misinformed prefrontal cortex, is to increase the alcohol intake in order to produce more dopamine with the intent of reaching the previous level of reward. Is this the full neuroscience explanation of why we pick drink after drink? Let's see if there's more on this further down the line. During this binge drinking, or a session as we call it, the stimuli are really strong and continuous, a drink after another, and therefore the dopamine does not have the physical time to clear itself. Reabsorption and reprocessing occur at a given fixed rate from the synapse, which remains flooded. This for one means that the nucleus accumbens receptors implement an even more aggressive defense mechanism. The D1 and D2 receptors that were being stored inside the cell, rather than recycled back to the surface, now begin to degrade. Rebuilding them from scratch is far more difficult than restoring their location. It can take weeks or months to do, as opposed to hours. The dopamine receptor degradation is a long-lasting change. While earlier the changes were temporary, receptor internalization and reduced receptor sensitivity, now they become long-lasting, therefore they become damages. The receptor degradation. However, we know that the reward system is composed also of the VTA, and here the changes don't even go through a temporary change first. Here the changes are directly long-lasting, and therefore they are immediately a damage to the system. In the VTA, we have the original senders of the dopamine. Those sender neurons have on their surface also autoreceptors that can sense through a physical chemical feedback loop that the synapse at the landing site, the nucleus accumbens, is already saturated with dopamine. So these autoreceptors send a signal back inside the VTA neuron to slow down dopamine production and therefore reduce its release. Although long-lasting, some recovery of the damage to the VTA neurons may occur, depending on several factors. In the short to medium term, weeks to months of abstinence, the VTA's dopamine production capacity does begin to recover. The autoreceptors gradually recalibrate as they stop detecting excess dopamine in the synapse, and the inhibitory signal weakens. However, with repeated binge cycles and prolonged heavy drinking, the VTA neurons undergo deeper changes beyond the autoreceptors' feedback. These include alterations in gene expression. The neurons actually change which genes are active, affecting how much dopamine-producing enzyme they manufacture. This is a more structural change than a temporary feedback adjustment, and it takes significantly longer to reverse. ASAM concludes that the VTL function can partially recover with prolonged abstinence. Research suggests meaningful improvement over months to a year or more, but there is evidence that full restoration to pre-addiction baseline may not occur in all individuals, particularly those with long drinking histories or genetic predispositions. Let's now explore another one of those senior staff members at the executive table, the stress system. What happens here happens in parallel to what's happening in the reward system. These two work concurrently. The extended amygdala, the major region of this system, is a composite structure. Think of it as a cluster of interconnected regions deep in the brain, comprising the central nucleus of the amygdala, CEA, the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, BNST, and the transitional area within the nucleus accumbens itself. This last detail is not incidental. The stress system and the reward system share real estate. They are neighbors, and in addition, they increasingly interfere with each other. The extended amygdala's primary role is threat detection and emotional memory. It's the system that makes us feel danger before our conscious mind has finished processing it. It operates fast and physically. The racing heart, the tightened chest, the spike of anxiety. It is designed to protect us. Like the reward circuitry, the stress circuitry has its initial signal, the processing and exercising of a specific function upon receiving of the signal, and the destination with its consequential result. The initial signal that the amygdala receives is sensory and emotional information from multiple sources: the thalamus, the cortex, the hippocampus, via neural pathways, physical connections between brain regions made of axons, the same type of fibers that carry dopamine from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens. Those signals arrive in the form of neurotransmitters that bind to receptors on the amygdala's neurons. And the amygdala processes and integrates all of those incoming signals from multiple sources simultaneously. The processing exercised by the extended amygdala is the release of its own key chemical player, the corticotropin releasing factor, which we'll call CRF. Think of CRF as the stress system's equivalent of dopamine in the reward system. It is the primary signaling molecule that sets the whole stress response in motion. Unlike dopamine, which has to travel from A to B, what's interesting here is that the major recipients of the CRF are within the extended amygdala itself. CRF is both released and received within the amygdala. There are just different neurons at play, those that generate it and those that receive it, the CRF1 receptors. The function of the CRF is to produce a stress response for the brain, in order to warn it so that it can make decisions to remove the cause of the stress. The brain will indeed remove the hand from the stove, will duck when hearing explosions, will interrupt a predictable conversation knowing to produce extreme discomfort, etc. This happens as soon as CRF binds to the CRF1 receptors, who get activated and produce the behavioral and emotional stress response, the anxiety, the hypervigilance, the dread, the emotional pain. The fascinating thing about the extended amygdala is that it learns. It learns like AI. Through experience, the amygdala needs fewer signals to produce a similar response, provided that those fewer signals are of the same type as those that did arrive in multitude beforehand and that did justify a big response. The best way I understood this was thinking of a war veteran with untreated PTSD. This guy would experience fear, anxiety and terror just when the fireworks are going off next door. His amygdala has associated the sound of an explosion during the war with mortal danger. Through repeated traumatic experience, obviously, the amygdala has no ears, so it receives the chemical signals of the sound of an explosion. The association between the explosion sound and mortal danger is stored at the cellular, structural level. After the war, when the fireworks go off next door, the amygdala doesn't consult the cortex and reason through the situation, that is, there is no war going on. Instead, it immediately produces CRF, activating the full stress response, racing heart, terror, the urge to take cover, because it has genuinely learned that that sound means death. So here's the thing. The amygdala learned, but it's inherently a little stupid. The cortex may know perfectly well it's a firework display, but the amygdala doesn't care. The extended amygdala responds to what it learned, not to what is currently true. In its own right, it's not a bad design. If I put my hand on the stove and it's burning hot, I instinctively move my hand even without realizing the hob dial is on, the light is on, and the whole stove is on. I may notice that later, but in the meantime, the amygdala has saved my skin, well, my hand. And the amygdala has learned. The first time I put my hand on the stove, I left it there long enough to get actually burnt. Today, as an adult, I instinctively move my hand away almost before the skin touches the hob. Thanks for that. On the first drinking session, the amygdala's response is purely physiological. Alcohol itself, as a foreign toxic substance entering the body, generates real physiological signals, changes in blood chemistry, heart rate, body temperature, blood pressure, that travel via the neural pathways from the thalamus, cortex and hippocampus into the extended amygdala as genuine physical threat signals. It would seem a contradiction at this time to be talking about these negative responses generated by the brain when we think about a drinking session, as we actually feel good during it. And there are no negative states or feelings associated with it. But the effects of alcohol are much more subtle than this. Yes, CRF gets released in response to the physiological threat posed by alcohol, but alcohol itself, specifically its ethanol molecules, is present and floating around all these neurons, and actively suppresses the normal biochemical activity of the neurons that have receptors with sites that ethanol can bind to, primarily GABA-A receptors and NMDA glutamate receptors. This means that while we are drinking, the CRF is indeed produced and released, but it lands on anesthetized receptors that cannot respond to it, and we do not get the full stress negative response. So during a drinking session, the upregulated CRF system, with all its extra receptors and heightened sensitivity, is being chemically silenced by the alcohol itself. What's interesting is that this silencing action on the CRF system is on the whole of it, so it quietens also other CRF produced by other stimuli. For example, ever heard somebody offering a stiff drink to a person that just went through a traumatic experience so they'd feel better? And yes, they do feel better afterwards. Now we understand why. The person feels relief, calm, with a reduced anxiety. The very stress system that has been structurally rewired to produce more fear and anxiety is being temporarily anesthetized. However, as soon as we stop drinking, even the abstinence that follows a first drinking session, the ethanol molecules disappear from the liquid surrounding the neurons in the amygdala, and therefore the CRF can get released and generates anxiety, irritability, hangover. Bottom line, alcohol will indeed produce CRF with all its negative connotations, but during a drinking session, alcohol itself is anesthetizing the system, so we still have all the great effect of dopamine and zero effects of the CRF. The fact that as soon as alcohol starts leaving the system, we become increasingly agitated is not only noticeable the day after a drinking session, or weeks/months/years after it, but even during the same drinking session. For example, if there's a very long queue at the bar and we've got to wait up to half an hour for the next drink, we do become increasingly agitated. This is exactly why. To paint a complete picture of the stress system, the CRF has also another pathway of secondary but no less importance, the HPA. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis is the primary neuroendocrine system managing stress responses, connecting the central nervous system to the endocrine system. The released CRF also travels upward to activate the HPA axis, signaling the hypothalamus, which then signals the pituitary gland, which then signals the adrenal glands to release cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone, which, when functioning correctly, acts as a natural dampener on the stress response. It feeds back to the brain to say, enough, stand down. And it's part of the system's self-regulation. Hold that thought as we'll see what changes in the HPA as well. Let's look at the whole stress system changes upon alcohol intake first. When the signals received by the amygdala originate from alcohol, the amygdala shows off all its learning abilities, and there's really nothing to be grateful for. Like for the stove, the amygdala learned that a specific set of signals/inputs mean a specific threat. Therefore, when learning, it progressively needs less and less physiological inputs in order to put in play its defense mechanism, the CRF release. Eventually, like for the explosions heard by the war veteran, it doesn't need real signals at all to release CRF. Just something that feels like it is enough to send the system into a stress state. Of course, during heavy drinking, the stress system receives really an avalanche of threat requests that needs to process in order to put in place its life-saving mitigation measures through the brain. Therefore, the CRF neurons in the extended amygdala become progressively sensitized through repeated heavy exposure, and each bout of heavy drinking causes the CRF system to upregulate, producing more CRF receptors and making existing ones more sensitive. The extended amygdala is at this point being structurally rewired toward a higher stress baseline with each drinking cycle. A higher stress baseline means that the same quantity of input signals will produce a much higher quantity of CRF, which brings anxiety, irritability, fear, and all the hangover symptoms. And it gets worse with each cycle. ASAM documents what is called the kindling effect, borrowed from the observation that repeated small electrical stimulations of the brain tissue eventually produce full seizures. Applied to the amygdala, it means this: each withdrawal episode leaves the stress system more reactive than before, not less. The amygdala doesn't habituate to repeated withdrawal, it does the opposite. Each cycle lowers the threshold further, so that progressively less provocation is needed to produce a full stress response. This is why the alcoholic's experience tends to get worse over time, not better, even when the amounts consumed remain the same or decrease. The disease is not standing still, it is learning. The result is concrete. Because the receptors have multiplied and are sensitized, eventually the extended amygdala begins producing stress responses to inputs smaller than before. So stimuli that previously wouldn't have triggered a meaningful stress response at all now produce a full CRF release. And what happens at this point to the other outlet of the CRF? Upon repeated heavy alcohol intake, the HPA axis becomes blunted at the hormonal level and stops responding proportionally to stress with cortisol, the hormone that allows the brain to cope with stress. So we have a hyper-produced CRF, but the cortisol effect that would normally help contain and wind down the stress response that would help the brain to cope is weakened. Which means that we are not just experiencing more stress, we are experiencing stress with a progressively diminished biological capacity to cope with it. There is a further mechanism that connects the stress system directly back to the reward system. The excessive release of dopamine during heavy drinking activates what are called dynorphin systems. Dynorphin, through its action on kappa opioid receptors, actively suppresses dopamine release. This means the stress system, once recruited, begins making the reward deficit worse. The two systems are not just running in parallel, they are compounding each other's damage. We're almost finished learning about the major senior staff at the executives table. While the previous systems are quite localized, the neuroregulatory system is pretty much pervasive around the brain. As per its name, its function is regulatory, and is of great importance to the functioning or malfunctioning of any system in the brain. Therefore, when it's affected by alcohol intake abuse, the consequences fall onto all the other systems listed so far, adding to their own respective damage. There are two major amino acids at play in the neuroregulatory system, GABA and glutamate, and both function also as neurotransmitters here. GABA, or gamma-aminobutyric acid, is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. When it binds to a neuron, it changes its electrostatic charge to a negative charge, making that neuron less likely to activate and release the chemical signals it is designed to produce. Its function is to downregulate those neurons, therefore to contain their hyperactivity. Almost every neuron has GABA receptors, and all the neurons that comprise both the reward system and the stress system have them. The GABA neurons, GABAergic neuron, are present almost anywhere, and they release GABA to their nearby neurons when they sense that the surrounding neurons are too active, more active than normal, as GABA is present on both the reward system and the stress system. It reduces and regulates the dopamine activity in the reward system, that is reducing the produced pleasure, and it reduces the activity of the CRF in the extended amygdala, that is reducing the produced anxiety and fear. Glutamate is another amino acid. It specifically is the ionized form of glutamic acid. Glutamate is the opposite of GABA. It is the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter. When glutamate binds to a neuron, it changes its electrostatic charge to a positive charge, making that neuron more likely to activate and release the chemical signals it is designed to produce. So while GABA reduces any activity of any neuron it lands on, glutamate gets that neuron to produce in overdrive. Any neuron touched by glutamate works like crazy. And glutamate is the most abundant neurotransmitter in the brain, present in the majority of neural circuits. Therefore, we have glutamate receptors, specifically NMDA receptors, on all the neurons that comprise both the reward system and the stress system. So, what happens to GABA and glutamate when we drink alcohol? In AA, we read that alcohol is cunning, and indeed it is. We know that ethanol molecules are tiny, water and fat soluble. This means that they do not need any specific neurotransmitter or pathway to reach and bind to neurons. The ethanol molecules cross the bloodstream-brain barrier and get to sit, float, into the liquid that surrounds the neurons of both the reward and the stress systems. When learning about the CRF being anesthetized by the ethanol molecules surrounding its neurons, we didn't know that the same ethanol molecules also attach to a separate site on the GABA-A receptor, not the same site where GABA binds, of both the CRF and dopamine cells, and work on the receptor's electrostatic charges. They amplify the negative charge effect that GABA already produces, and therefore they multiply the downward regulation effect that GABA has on both dopamine and CRF. Therefore, alcohol itself causes also a reduction of both pleasure and anxiety/fear. The ethanol molecules do a similar job with glutamate, as they attach to a separate site on the glutamate NMDA receptors, not the same site where glutamate binds, and work on the receptor's electrostatic charges, reducing the positive charge that they have and therefore causing the glutamate to be far less responsive. This means that the hyperactivity, that is more dopamine and more CRF, that glutamate wants to cause to a given neuron is greatly reduced. Therefore, again, alcohol causes a reduction of both pleasure and anxiety/fear. The brain tries to defend its neuroregulatory system through biochemical feedback loops by simultaneously downregulating the GABA receptors, making the inhibitory system weaker, and upregulating the glutamate receptors, making the excitatory system more sensitive and more powerful. Both compensatory changes are attempts to restore balance against alcohol's depressant effect. With repeated drinking, these changes become structural and permanent. The GABA brake is now chronically weakened, and the glutamate accelerator is chronically hypersensitized. More dopamine can get freely released, and the CRF produced gets silenced before it can transmit, as long as alcohol is present. And this process is progressive and chronic. Each cycle of the drinking and withdrawal deepens the neuroadaptations. The reward system becomes more blunted. The stress system becomes more reactive. Tolerance increases, requiring more alcohol to achieve less effect, which accelerates the damage. It is, in the fullest medical sense of the word, a disease, a chronic, progressive alteration of brain structure and function. As I said, when we drink, we feel good, but then we stop drinking. Maybe even within the same drinking session we take a break. Or maybe there is a break between one session and another. As we alcoholics know, these breaks between sessions tend progressively to get shorter and shorter. ASAM explains actually why that is the case, why we do that from a neurological and biochemical perspective. We found out a lot of long-lasting changes caused to the biochemistry of the brain by heavy alcohol consumption. And we also identified the physical reason why, when we drink, we feel good. We are now firmly in the scenario in which all changes to the reward system, the stress system, and the neuroregulatory system, the system that maintains the brain's biochemical balance, have occurred. And now we stop drinking. No more alcohol reaches the system. This abstinence, hours long, days long, months, years, meets, therefore, just to recap, the following situation. In the reward system, there are changes in the release of dopamine from the VTA so that a lot less dopamine gets produced compared to the same given amount of brain signals that request it. And there are also changes to how much dopamine gets passed on to the brain as pleasure signals. A lot less dopamine gets passed on compared to the given quantity of the dopamine that successfully binds in. Looking therefore at understanding with a rough example the three situations before, during and after the changes, I get these details of what happens in and to the reward system. Prior to heavily drinking, if the brain is experiencing a normal pleasurable activity, such a walk in the park, it sends 50 biochemistry signals to the VTA, 50 dopamine signals get produced, 50 dopamine signals can bind successfully into the receptors of the nucleus accumbens, and 50 pleasure signals are sent to the brain. During heavy drinking, assume all numbers at 500, up to and including 500 pleasure signals sent to the brain. In this after the changes scenario that I want to explore, and assuming an overall malfunction of 50% for the sake of illustration, the brain sends 50 signals to the VTA because it's experiencing normal pleasurable activity such a walk in the park, but the VTA produces only 25 dopamine signals because it's changed/damaged, and in turn, only 12.5 dopamine signals can successfully bind into the receptors of the nucleus accumbens. So only 12.5 pleasure signals get sent out to the brain. Compared to before, I'd have to take 4 walks to get the pleasure of 1. When alcohol is removed, we therefore have simultaneously a weakened brake and a supercharged accelerator. That combination, GABA underactive, glutamate overactive, is what produces the dangerous rebound hyperexcitability of withdrawal, and it is that glutamate surge that floods the extended amygdala and triggers the CRF cascade. So glutamate is not just background biochemistry here. It is the specific mechanism that makes withdrawal neurologically dangerous and physically felt. The whole brain and alcohol, wow. That was some brain dump altogether. Despite my attempts at summarizing, paraphrasing and exemplifying ASAM, there's only so much you can push it in neuroscience, biochemistry, etc. And at times you really need to get to digest it all. But here's the thing, I risked getting lost at this stage, so I put it all together as I want to know what happens before and after drinking. During alcohol intake, in the single session case, the brain receives a massive surge of pleasure while every stress and threat signal, whether produced by the alcohol itself or by whatever else life is throwing at you, is chemically silenced before it can land. The VTA is flooded with signals from alcohol intake, producing a massive surge of dopamine, far beyond what any normal pleasurable activity produces. GABA is downregulating effect rendered even stronger by the ethanol molecules, suppresses dopamine activity both in the VTA and the nucleus accumbens. Glutamate, suppressed as well by the ethanol molecules, cannot perform its natural excitatory function to counteract GABA. The default mode network, also suppressed by ethanol, reduces its interoceptive amplification function. The internal mental chatter, self-awareness, and sense of unease quieten down, contributing further to the sense of relief and well-being during drinking. The nucleus accumbens defends itself using receptor internalization and reduced receptor sensitivity both reduce the amount of dopamine that successfully binds. Net result, despite all these defenses combined, a massive dopamine surge reaches the brain, producing euphoria. The extended amygdala receives the threat signals from alcohol, identified as a toxic substance, and produces CRF. GABA would downregulate this, but is slowed down by the ethanol molecules present, and glutamate would accelerate it, but cannot do so properly for the same reason. This accumulation of CRF is waiting because ethanol simultaneously suppresses the CRF1 receptors at the receiving end, so the produced and released CRF, ready to bind to the receptors, cannot trigger the stress response, sending the warning signals of anxiety, irritability, dread, fear to the brain, and so on. The HPA axis is not yet damaged, so cortisol production remains intact. Net result: the CRF gets produced but cannot transmit to the brain, therefore the brain receives no negative signals. During alcohol intake, in the after repeated sessions case, the same artificial pleasure occurs as in the single session, but now the brain has been so structurally rewired that an enormous payload of pain and distress is silently accumulating, held back only by the alcohol itself, and will be released the moment it clears. All of the above applies, up to and including the resulting euphoria. Plus, the DMN has itself become sensitized. Its interoceptive amplification of craving and unease is now chronically elevated also in periods of abstinence between sessions and becomes the new baseline. So during a session, its suppression by ethanol produces an even much higher sense of relief and well-being than in the single session case, further reinforcing the compulsion to drink. Receptor degradation in the nucleus accumbens is now present, further reducing dopamine binding with its receptors. Net result: the same euphoria is produced as in the single session case, but the dopamine system is now more damaged, meaning the brain is working harder and harder to produce a reward it is progressively less capable of sustaining. The extended amygdala is now structurally sensitized. Stimuli that would not previously have triggered a stress response now produce a full CRF release, compounding with the already high CRF production from the alcohol threat signals themselves, together with the CRF produced by the not true signals of the extended amygdala that has learned, back to the example of the veteran who ducks when hearing nearby fireworks. The HPA axis is now blunted. When the CRF eventually binds after alcohol leaves and is released along the axis to produce cortisol, the production will be far insufficient compared to the sheer amount of CRF present. Net result: a massive amount of CRF is accumulating and waiting, with no adequate cortisol response available to contain it, ready to discharge its full payload the moment ethanol clears. After alcohol intake, here's what is happening to the full system after alcohol leaves the bloodstream, and therefore after the ethanol molecules leave the neuronal liquid and stop anesthetizing any nearby cell. In the short term, hours to the day after alcohol leaves, in the single session case, we will experience far less pleasure because the brain does not receive the surge of signals provoked by alcohol anymore, but just the normal daily pleasures, and we may get nausea or a headache, but we won't get all the rest of the stress response. We'd be tired but back up and running in no time, with no disproportionate sense of unease or craving. This happens because we now learn this. The VTA stops receiving alcohol-driven flow of signals and starts processing again only the pleasure signals from normal daily life, from which it produces a normal amount of dopamine. The nucleus accumbens defenses, receptor internalization, and reduced receptor sensitivity were temporary and begin reversing to normal within hours, allowing a correct release of dopamine not long after the drinking has stopped. Net result: a minor temporary reduction in dopamine signaling, but the system largely recovers within hours or days with no significant lasting effect. The CRF that was accumulated and waiting during alcohol intake now releases its signal to the brain. However, the HPA axis has not yet been damaged by repeated heavy alcohol intake, so it can still produce adequate cortisol, counteracting the stress signals sent by CRF. That is, the brain can cope with them. While the inhibitory system, GABA, has been weakened and the excitatory system, glutamate, is now more sensitive and more powerful, these compensatory changes are still temporary at this stage and begin reversing as the ethanol molecules clear. The neuroregulatory system gradually returns toward its pre-drinking balance. The DMN returns to its normal baseline function as the ethanol molecules clear. The interoceptive amplification resumes its normal level, and the internal mental chatter and self-awareness return to their pre-drinking state. Net result: the brain returns to baseline within hours or days with no structural damage and no disproportionate amplification of either craving or stress. After alcohol intake, in the short term, hours to the day after alcohol leaves, in the after repeated sessions case, we will experience simultaneously a collapse of pleasure and a surge of pain. The brain receives far less pleasure signaling than its pre-drinking baseline, while being flooded with anxiety, dread and physical distress, with no adequate biological means to cope with any of it for the following reasons. Exactly like in the single session case, the VTA stops receiving alcohol-driven flood of signals and starts processing again only the pleasure signals from normal daily life. However, now the VTA is damaged and its dopamine production is far reduced. Therefore, on top of receiving far less requesting signals compared with when there was alcohol intake, it is able to produce less dopamine because of that. GABA could theoretically finish its own job of reducing any dopamine that's being produced/released, but it's been damaged and it's weaker, so its inhibitor-down-regulator effect is smaller. Glutamate could now also resume its normal job of exciting both dopamine production and release, effectively counterweighing GABA, but its damages consist of being made hyperactive, so it tries to produce more dopamine than the damaged VTA cells can do, and it tries to release more dopamine than the damaged nucleus accumbens cells can release. The glutamate damages could actually be helpful here, but are counteracted by the other changes. Net result: dopamine crash. The brain receives far less pleasure signaling than its pre-drinking baseline. Like in the single session case, the CRF receptors also are free from the invading ethanol molecules and wake up, now hypersensitized from structural changes, and bind immediately to the accumulated waiting CRF. However, the amount of CRF released is very different and is now massive, because previous sessions caused the damaging changes. The total amount of CRF produced comes from O physical threat signals, elevated heart rate, blood pressure, etc. O sensitization of the CRF production neurons, who now need less signal to produce a full CRF. O learned behavior of the amygdala, who triggers CRF production based on untrue/false signals, the fireworks explosions of our veteran. The HPA axis has now been damaged by repeated heavy alcohol intake, so it can no longer produce adequate cortisol to counteract the stress signals sent by the CRF. The brain now is left with no means to cope with stress. The DMN, no longer suppressed by ethanol, resumes its function, but in the repeated sessions case, it has itself become chronically sensitized, so its interoceptive amplification returns not to a normal baseline, but to an elevated one. The internal mental chatter, the sense of unease, and the awareness of a craving return immediately and forcefully, amplifying the stress signals already being sent by the CRF flood. Net result: we experience an acute stress surge, anxiety, irritability, dread, racing heart, the full hangover experience, which is also disproportionate to any actual external threat. And here is what all of that biochemistry actually feels like from the inside. The shaking hands, the sweating, the racing heart, the crushing anxiety that arrives from nowhere and attaches to nothing in particular, the inability to sleep despite exhaustion, the sense of impending doom that no rational thought can shift. This is withdrawal. That is a nervous system in biochemical crisis, responding exactly as its altered chemistry dictates. Every alcoholic knows this experience. Now we know exactly why it happens. After alcohol intake, in the medium term, weeks after alcohol leaves. In the single session case, we feel perfectly normal. The system has fully returned to pre-drinking baseline. No residual changes remain. Net result: the person is completely fine, as if the session never happened biochemically. After alcohol intake, in the medium term, weeks after alcohol leaves. In the after repeated sessions case, the acute crisis has passed, but the person is now living in a gray, uncomfortable version of normal, where there is less pleasure from everything, more stress from everything, and a diminished biological capacity to cope with either. The dopamine production capacity is still significantly below what it used to be before the onset of heavy drinking sessions, because the VTA production ability remains damaged. Early partial recovery of the VTA autoreceptors may begin in this period of abstinence, but it is slow and incomplete. Because the nucleus accumbens receptor degradation remains in place and is not a temporary change like receptor internalization or sensitization, as in the single session case, the brain does not experience the same pleasure when sober that it used to experience before the onset of heavy drinking sessions. Net result, pleasure signaling from normal daily activities remains significantly below than what it was before. The acute CRF discharge has completed, but the extended amygdala remains structurally sensitized. Its elevated baseline CRF production is now chronic, so weeks after the last alcohol intake, we still experience higher levels of CRF in the absence of alcohol. Any normal daily threat signal now produces more CRF. For example, prior to the sensitization, we'd perceive a stress signal intensity of 50 because we're late for work, but after the system damage, we now experience a 75 stress intensity. Additionally, the ordinary daily stimuli that would not previously have triggered a stress response now produce a full CRF release. GABA could theoretically finish its own job of reducing any dopamine that's being produced/released, but it's been damaged and it's weaker, so its inhibitor down-regulator effect is smaller. Glutamate could now also resume its normal job of exciting both dopamine production and release, effectively counterweighing GABA, but its damages consist of being made hyperactive, so it tries to produce more dopamine than the damaged VTA cells can do, and it tries to release more dopamine than the damaged nucleus accumbens cells can release. The glutamate damages could actually be helpful here, but are counteracted by the other changes. Net result, dopamine crash. The brain receives far less pleasure signaling than its pre-drinking baseline. Like in the single session case, the CRF receptors also are free from the invading ethanol molecules and wake up, now hypersensitized from structural changes, and bind immediately to the accumulated waiting CRF. However, the amount of CRF released is very different and is now massive, because previous sessions caused the damaging changes. The total amount of CRF produced comes from physical threat signals, elevated heart rate, blood pressure, etc. Sensitization of the CRF production neurons, who now need less signal to produce a full CRF. Learned behavior of the amygdala, who triggers CRF production based on untrue/false signals, the fireworks explosions of our veteran. The HPA axis has now been damaged by repeated heavy alcohol intake, so it can no longer produce adequate cortisol to counteract the stress signals sent by the CRF. The brain now is left with no means to cope with stress. The DMN, no longer suppressed by ethanol, resumes its function, but in the repeated sessions case, it has itself become chronically sensitized, so its interoceptive amplification returns not to a normal baseline, but to an elevated one. The internal mental chatter, the sense of unease, and the awareness of a craving return immediately and forcefully, amplifying the stress signals already being sent by the CRF flood. Net result, we experience an acute stress surge, anxiety, irritability, dread, racing heart, the full hangover experience, which is also disproportionate to any actual external threat. And here is what all of that biochemistry actually feels like from the inside. The shaking hands, the sweating, the racing heart, the crushing anxiety that arrives from nowhere and attaches to nothing in particular, the inability to sleep despite exhaustion, the sense of impending doom that no rational thought can shift. This is withdrawal. That is a nervous system in biochemical crisis, responding exactly as its altered chemistry dictates. Every alcoholic knows this experience. Now we know exactly why it happens. after alcohol intake, in the medium term, weeks after alcohol leaves. In the single session case, we feel perfectly normal. The system has fully returned to pre-drinking baseline. No residual changes remain. Net result: the person is completely fine, as if the session never happened biochemically. After alcohol intake, in the medium term, weeks after alcohol leaves. In the after repeated sessions case, the acute crisis has passed, but the person is now living in a gray, uncomfortable version of normal, where there is less pleasure from everything, more stress from everything, and a diminished biological capacity to cope with either. The dopamine production capacity is still significantly below what it used to be before the onset of heavy drinking sessions, because the VTA production ability remains damaged. Early partial recovery of the VTA autoreceptors may begin in this period of abstinence, but it is slow and incomplete. Because the nucleus accumbens receptor degradation remains in place and is not a temporary change like receptor internalization or sensitization, as in the single session case, the brain does not experience the same pleasure when sober that it used to experience before the onset of heavy drinking sessions. Net result: pleasure signaling from normal daily activities remains significantly below than what it was before. The acute CRF discharge has completed, but the extended amygdala remains structurally sensitized. Its elevated baseline CRF production is now chronic, so weeks after the last alcohol intake, we still experience higher levels of CRF in the absence of alcohol. Any normal daily threat signal now produces more CRF. For example, prior to the sensitization, we'd perceive a stress signal intensity of 50 because we're late for work, but after the system damage, we now experience a 75 stress intensity. Additionally, the ordinary daily stimuli that would not previously have triggered a stress response now produce a full CRF release. In summary, now let me bring it all together, because after everything we've just been through, I want to be able to answer one of the questions that started all of this. Why do we drink the way we do, and why can't we stop? During a drinking session, this happens. In the single session case, alcohol floods the brain with pleasure, while simultaneously silencing all negative signals, producing an artificially perfect emotional state that no normal life experience can replicate. In the after repeated sessions case, the same artificial pleasure occurs, but now the system is so structurally damaged and sensitized that there is a real threat posed by the major quantities of negative feelings and emotional states that will arrive as soon as alcohol will leave the system. And after alcohol leaves the system, in the case of an alcoholic, this happens. In the hours and days after alcohol leaves, the brain simultaneously crashes into a pleasure deficit and floods with anxiety, dread, and physical distress, the full hangover, with no biological capacity to cope with any of it. In the weeks that follow, the acute crisis passes, but the person is living in a persistently gray and uncomfortable state, less pleasure from everything, more stress from everything, and a diminished ability to handle either. The reward system has been so severely recalibrated by alcohol that normal life pleasures do not register as meaningful reward, the 4 walks in the park to get the pleasure of 1. In the months and years of abstinence, the systems begin slowly and partially to recover, pleasure gradually returns, stress gradually reduces, and coping capacity slowly rebuilds. For some individuals, this recovery is substantial. For others, a full return to how things felt before heavy drinking began may never occur. What we have just described, in all its biochemical detail, across all systems, and through all the time frames, has a single word in common and clinical usage: craving. But this is not the craving of someone who wants a chocolate muffin with their tea. To understand what kind of craving this is, consider what systems have been recruited. The amygdala, the brain's survival threat detector, that has learned through repeated withdrawal to classify the absence of alcohol as a danger. The reward system, the brain's mechanism for reinforcing survival behaviors like eating and reproduction, that has been hijacked to produce its highest possible reward signal in response to alcohol. Two survival systems operating simultaneously and below conscious awareness have been retrained to treat alcohol as essential to life itself. The craving that results is therefore not a thought, not a choice, not a weakness of character, but a physical state generated by the brain's own survival machinery, now operating exactly as its damaged architecture demands. That is what Silkworth called allergy. That is what ASAM calls impaired control. And please do not make the societal mistake of thinking that the alcoholic is craving the pleasure they remember from when they were drinking. They are not craving the chocolate muffin. That may have been true for the first session or two, but as the disease progresses, the craving has a different origin entirely and therefore a very different objective. One that we have come to demonstrate in full. The amygdala has learned to associate low or absent alcohol levels with the pain and suffering of previous withdrawals. Over time, its threat threshold has shifted and it begins firing CRF earlier and earlier, even when alcohol levels are still present but falling. The craving is no longer aspiring to reach pleasure, but now towards relief, towards fleeing from the pain that the brain has learned is coming. And with each drinking cycle, that threshold shifts further and the craving intensifies, even as the pleasure diminishes. In essence, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of willpower, judgment, and decision-making, is now fighting on two fronts simultaneously. A reward system that only responds to alcohol, and a stress system that is screaming for relief. That's why we can run a business, raise children, or maintain extraordinary discipline in every other area of life, but cannot resist one drink. It's not that our willpower is weak, it's that our willpower is being deployed against a neurobiological insurgency that operates below the level of conscious choice. Wow! I can say that now. I cannot believe I have changed my mind. Indeed, now I understand. I learned. And therefore I believe that the alcoholic drinks for relief and has no other choice but to do so. It is indeed a physical disease. The obsession of the mind. At this point, do you remember what was the second problem we alcoholics are facing? That even if we resolve not to drink, we inevitably end up drinking, even if we've been sober a long time. Well, a good understanding of the current neuroscience and biochemistry knowledge allowed us to explain why we have that problem up to a year into our newfound abstinence, or maybe up to 2 years. I am extrapolating from the potential reversibility of damages listed in ASAM. However, in the rooms of AA, we hear often what is also mentioned in the Big Book multiple times. We are at risk of relapsing for the rest of our lives, and if we fall for it even after 30 years of sobriety, the downfall is going to be tragically spectacular. This is called by Silkworth and AA the obsession of the mind, the baffling inability of the alcoholic to remember with sufficient force what happens when they drink. It's the strange mental blank spot that allows someone with months or years of sobriety, who knows the consequences, to somehow convince themselves that this time it will be different. It's not a conscious thought loop like an obsession would be within the parameters of clinical OCD. It's deeper than that. It operates below rational awareness. The sober alcoholic with no alcohol in their system, no active craving, who somehow walks into a bar. That's the real mystery. The ASAM principles see and describe this before the first drink moment as dysphoria, the persistent, grinding negative emotional state recognized as a core feature of the addicted brain even during abstinence. The restlessness, irritability and discontent, the feeling that something is fundamentally wrong, that life without the substance is grey and intolerable, not a craving for alcohol specifically, but an inability to tolerate being without it. In dysphoria, the key concept is hyperkatifia, a term coined by George Koob, who is the director of the NIAAA and one of the most important figures in modern addiction neuroscience. The word comes from the Greek katifeia, meaning dejection or a negative emotional state. Hyperkatifeia is defined as the increased intensity of the constellation of negative emotional and motivational symptoms, observed during withdrawal from drugs of abuse. But critically, it doesn't just occur during acute withdrawal. It can extend into protracted abstinence and interact with learning processes in the form of conditioned withdrawal to facilitate relapse. The sober alcoholic who isn't in acute withdrawal but is living in a chronic state of emotional pain, they may not even be able to name. Hyperkatifeia reflects symptoms historically difficult to define: dysphoria, irritability, alexithymia, or simply symptoms often described as ill at ease, uncomfortable within one's own skin, or simply not hedonically normal. At first, we need a drink whenever we feel in a state of dysphoria, more on that later, to quiet down the general sense of uneasiness and unwellness, our CRE gets suppressed, and to feel again the pleasure because of the reward signals. Taking a lovely walk into the park, which could be sufficient to others and might have been sufficient to us before these changes, does not produce sufficient pleasure anymore to relieve this uneasiness. But drink does, and so we drink. Bottom line, drinking is about what we perceive being our emotional survival. The alcoholic's entire experience of being alive has been dulled, and only alcohol temporarily restores something resembling normal feeling. That's the trap. I loved ASAM's information and explanations so much that when I looked in ASAM for answers to the solution problem, not to the why, but to the how can we fix it, I was catapulted in a full anticlimax. The answer isn't stated, it's confessed between the lines. At the end of their chapter on the anatomy of addiction, after everything we have just learned, ASAM concludes: through the integration of these components, we will be much more likely to generate individually tailored therapies, both pharmacological and behavioral, for those that find themselves on this continuum of addiction. Will be more likely. Future tense. This is an aspiration, not a solution. Clinically, therefore, more than 350 experts agree that we haven't yet succeeded in resolving this blank spot of the sober alcoholic who walks into a bar. There are no medicinal or psychotherapeutically specific identified methods to cure somebody from the sudden, inexplicable need to pick up a drink after months and years of successful sobriety. Allow me a sidebar here, and let's be clear. I am not any longer deluding myself that full recovery means a restoration of my physical and mental state to that of a non-alcoholic, but rather a state that can help me daily and for my lifetime from ever reaching that blank spot that can bring me to the first drink. That specific thing is what I would term cured or recovered. I am willing to go further. I would consider myself cured and recovered, even if that would mean taking tablets every day, or going to a specific psychotherapy every day for the rest of my life, as long as that was to safeguard me against that blank spot. But via ASAM's own admission, neither are viable options. However, AA tells me just that this state of recovery is indeed possible. It is possible through what they term spiritual awakening and working the program daily, one day at a time. It is interesting to know that the Big Book refers to the spiritual awakening also as a psychic change, and the Big Book never uses terms unknowingly. Each word and sentence is full of meaning. So I'm leaving ASAM aside for a moment, and I'm looking at Carl Gustav Jung, whose major works were contemporary to the forming of AA and to the first edition of the Big Book, 1939. Jung's theories and discoveries greatly influenced the AA founders, and this is documented both in the Big Book and in plenty of literature and letters with the co-founders of AA. I am therefore trying to see if Jung's research helps me to understand this AA concept of obsession. For Jung, the central project of human psychological life is individuation, the gradual process by which a person comes to know and integrate all parts of themselves, including the parts they have hidden, denied, or never yet confronted. A person who has not yet begun this process lives in what Jung called the pre-individuation state, psychologically fragmented, driven by forces they cannot see or name, and experiencing the resulting suffering as something the world is doing to them, rather than something happening within them. This is not a moral failing. It is simply where most people are to varying degrees before the work begins. What ASAM calls dysphoria, what AA calls insanity, Jung calls the pre-individuation state, where the psyche has not yet confronted its shadow, has not yet begun the work of integration, and is therefore living in a state of inner fragmentation and unconscious suffering. A state in which a person doesn't yet know why they are in pain, only that they are. In a sense, I am slowly discovering not only a neuroscientific biochemical basis for the AA program that is making sense to me, but also a clinical one. I can finally make sense of my own life and experience through this newfound understanding of the allergy of the body and the obsession of the mind. This is the basis for my subsequent understanding and therefore my acceptance of the concepts of powerlessness and unmanageability. Powerlessness and unmanageability. My research so far brought me to understanding powerlessness over the allergy, the abnormal metabolic response, the acetaldehyde mechanism, the craving that fires once alcohol enters the body. Understanding this was deeply revealing to me, but understanding what follows flicked the light switch. We are also powerless over the obsession itself. We cannot predict it, cannot prevent it through willpower, and don't even recognize it when it's operating. It's the blank spot. It's about the entire physical and psychic apparatus that leads to the drink. It's the dysphoria that ASAM describes, but that cannot steer towards a certain therapeutic path through to resolution. In other words, we are powerless over both the allergy and the obsession. But step 1 asks us to also acknowledge, admit and accept the fact that our lives have become unmanageable. Okay, so unmanageability. I have to say that AA meetings, my sponsor, the Big Book, and AHA literature helped me enormously to discover what this word actually meant. On its surface, it is obvious to me that the wreckage itself of my life when I was drinking was, by definition, unmanageable. In any AA meetings, you hear members sharing about lost jobs, broken relationships, ruined or lost families, health consequences, the overall chaos that drinking produces. But like for powerlessness, unmanageability has 2 layers. And here the second is really insidious. The unmanageability of the sober alcoholic's life. The dysphoric, pre-individuated state doesn't just create vulnerability to the first drink, it's everything. The way you relate to people, the way you interpret events. The self-centeredness that AA identifies isn't vanity, it's a psyche in survival mode, turned entirely inward because it's in constant pain it can't name. Understanding this was crucial for me. AA does not talk about egocentrism in the way in which we can think of today as a character flaw. AA talks about self-centeredness as a symptom of a person in survival mode, the inevitable posture of a fragmented psyche in unconscious pain. And from that turned inward place, every interaction becomes about you. Every slight is magnified. Every relationship becomes transactional. What can you give me to make this pain stop? And when people can't or won't, the resentment builds, which deepens the isolation, which intensifies the pain, which tightens the spiral. Jung would recognize this immediately. The pre-individuated person is identified with the ego and the persona. They cannot see beyond their own perspective, because they haven't yet discovered that there is anything beyond their own perspective. The shadow is running the show, but they experience it as the world being unfair, people being unreliable, life being intolerable. The Big Book's image of the actor who wants to run the show in his own way is Jung's shadow by another name. The location of the problem is always outside. Nobody understands me is the cry of a psyche that doesn't yet understand itself. So unmanageability isn't just about the consequences of drinking. It's about the fact that even when sober, the alcoholic in this state cannot manage life, because the operating system they're running is corrupted. Their perceptions are distorted, their reactions are disproportionate, their relationships are poisoned by a need they can't articulate. And every attempt to fix things from within that state only deepens the problem. That's the vicious circle. This means step one is bigger than most people think. It's not just I can't control my drinking, it's I can't control my drinking and I can't control my living, and both for the same underlying reason. This is how I did step one. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable,